Hannah Murray on TRE in the afternoon.
Joining us on the line now is Roger Lytollis, who's been a features writer and columnist for some of the UK's best local papers. His book has a great title. It's called Panic as Man Burns Crumpets. It's about the trials and tribulations of being a reporter on a local newspaper. Welcome to the show, Roger.
Thanks, Hannah.
Oh, thanks very much for joining us. Great to have you with us. And I noticed that you've had some brilliant reviews from journalists up and down the country, which is great to see.
Yeah, I've been very, very gratified by those, really. I think a lot of journalists appreciate that someone's kind of described what the job is like, you know, the ups and downs of the job, the reality of the job. Sometimes it's an amazing thing to do. Sometimes it's a not so nice thing to do. But, you know, some very high profile journalists have said that they like it. So I think someone's kind of getting across the inside story of journalism. And that's really what I was hoping to do.
Yeah. And the stuff that you talk about, the stories and the anecdotes, it's a mixture of being hilarious and heartbreaking at times.
Yeah, I mean, that's what newspapers are like, because I suppose that's what life is like. You know, if newspapers are doing their job, they should be reflecting society and life. And so the book does that as well, because my career did that, as most journalists' careers do.
Yeah.
I mean, I did, covering very funny jobs like, I don't know, interviewing a male stripper, for example. That was quite an eye-opening job. Things like that, to reporting on real tragedies where, I mean, there was a mass shooting where I was working in 2010 where 12 people were shot dead, and, you know, to go and report on the aftermath of that, it's just a huge range of jobs that we do, because that's what journalism is.
Yeah. So when you got into this, when you went for your first job at a local paper, what were you expecting? What was your ambition?
Well, I mean, I was very kind of shy at the time, so really I was hoping to just sit quietly at my desk and write columns and not actually have to go out and speak to anybody. That was really what I was hoping the job would be like. And I mean, I was a columnist, but I realised that, you know, I couldn't make a living just by writing columns. So I had to go out into the scary big wide world and interview people. And the first time I did that, it was to go to a truck stop and ask truckers if they eat muesli, which was a kind of weird and wonderful story that journalists are often asked to do. Basically, there are always companies doing surveys, and I think surprisingly this survey that said that truckers were now eating muesli was done by a muesli company. So I was the poor so-and-so who was tasked with the job of going out to a truck stop and asking truckers, do you eat muesli? You know, so it's from someone who was very shy and never really spoke to anyone. So I have to walk into that environment and ask a pretty ridiculous question to a group of, you know, rather gruff people. It was quite a scary thing to do, but it was a bit of a baptism of fire. But that's what journalism is at times. You're kind of pushed out of your comfort zone, sometimes to do funny, quirky jobs like that, and sometimes to do jobs that are, you know, pretty grim, but it's all, you know, news needs to be reported. So that's what we do.
Yeah. And over your career, have you had the chance of interviewing more high-profile people? Any interesting anecdotes from that?
Yeah, I mean, I've interviewed mainly, it was a case of, you know, if a famous pop star or author was coming to a place I was working, their agent would arrange a series of phone interviews. So I interviewed people like Rod Stewart. Maybe that was about, you know, you get maybe 10 minutes on the phone with Rod. So it was quite strange, because the kind of things that made headlines, because it was Rod Stewart, you know, wouldn't make headlines if it was anybody else. I mean, I was working in a paper in Cumbria, and Rod said that he really likes Cumberland sausage. So that was the front page headline next day. Rod Stewart, I like Cumberland sausage, which is, if that had been anybody else, you know, if somebody else says, I like Cumberland sausage, it probably wouldn't make the front page of a local paper, but
yeah,
it just shows the sort of different standards that we have for celebrities, and anything that they say is basically newsworthy.
Yeah, interesting. And can you tell us some of the funny stories from the book?
Yeah, well, one story, I'm not sure it was meant to be funny, but I was doing a day in the life of a trawler fisherman. So I went out at about 5 o'clock in the morning to spend the day on a boat with a trawler fisherman in the Irish Sea. what's it like to be a trawler fisherman? I mean, I still have no idea what it's like to be a trawler fisherman, because within about 2 minutes of the boat leaving the harbour, I started to feel a bit queasy, and I just sort of leapt to the edge of the boat and threw up. I was violently sick.
No.
And all I could hear, there was a photographer on a boat with me, and I could just hear his camera was clicking in my face as I was being sick.
Did you make the paper?
That's right, yeah. I mean, when we got back to the newsroom next day, he was handing around photographs of me being sick.
God.
And I spent most of the day, when I should have been, describing the life of a trawler fisherman, was actually below decks, lying on a bunk with my eyes closed, trying not to be sick again. So from being above decks for about 5 minutes all day, I had to find about 1,500 words on what's it like to be a trawler fisherman, and that was a bit of a tough ask, I have to tell you.
Oh, I bet. Brilliant. And sorry, go on.
Another one, which is to do with water as well, in a slightly different way. A local swimming baths introduced a monthly naturist swimming session. So I thought that could be quite interesting if I could go along to that and interview some of the people involved, see why do they do this. So I contacted the organisers and said, would it be okay for me to come along and talk to some naturist swimmers? And they said, that would be absolutely fine, Roger, as long as you get your kit off as well and take part.
What?
I mean, that wasn't quite their exact words, but it might as well have been. So, yeah. So I said, yeah, okay. So
no way.
And again, unfortunately, there was a photographer there for that one as well. So,
oh, that's brilliant.
Yeah.
I mean, how you said you were a shy person. The next minute, you're interviewing people naked. I mean, that must have been frightening.
I mean, being a journalist, it's kind of like wearing a suit of armour. I mean, I wasn't wearing a suit of armour for the nature of swimming or anything else, but in general, that's what the job is like. I would, in normal life, just being me, I could never really do any of these things or talk to anyone. But as soon as I was doing it as a journalist, it just felt like I was protected somehow. It felt like it wasn't really me. It was, a kind of a superpowered version of me. And that's really what saw me through my career.
Interesting. What about the man with the pigeon tattoo?
Oh, yeah, that was a strange one. Yeah, I mean, I was interviewing a pigeon fancier, which I thought could be quite interesting. I never interviewed a pigeon fancier before. And I noticed some tattoos on this guy's arms. And I asked him to roll his sleeves up, and his arms were covered in tattoos of his favourite birds. Birds that he'd had and loved over the years with their names underneath. And it was just such a bizarre thing. You go out on a job which I think will be, fairly ordinary, and then you find a man whose arms are covered in tattoos of pigeons. It just shows you the kind of strange stories that are out there everywhere, really, if you know where to look, or
definitely
sometimes just find them by accident.
And what about your appearance on a BBC talk show that didn't go too well?
Yeah, I mean, some listeners will remember Kilroy, the BBC talk show of the 90s with Robert Kilroy Silk.
Yeah.
I mean, I wrote a column back then, and the producer of Kilroy saw this column. He thought that I would be a good person to go on the show because, the column was quite opinionated and bullshit, and he thought that sounded like the kind of person who would be good on Kilroy. But, the kind of person I actually was in real life, wasn't at all bullshit or opinionated. But I had this sort of strange idea when he asked me to go on the show. I thought this could be my big break, being on TV. This could be it. So I agreed to go on the show. But I was so nervous. I took a load of beta blockers just before going on, which are kind of, designed to slow down the heart rate and blood pressure. And they did that. But unfortunately, I was pretty much falling asleep. I was virtually unconscious by the time I went on air. So again, it didn't. I mean, when I think about it, my whole career has been a series of various humiliations. So yes, most of them are in the book.
Oh, fabulous. And I mean, it's a great title, Panic as Man Burns Crumpets. I mean, it's one of the sort of typical headlines that people kind of make up and make jokes about, that they love, I mean, from a warm place about local papers. Did you make this one up, or was it actually a headline?
It is actually a headline.
No.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't one of my stories, unfortunately, but yeah, I think we were looking for a kind of quirky newspaper headline. So we searched for, quirky on local newspaper headlines. We came up with a short list of about 20, and that was the one that came out as the most popular. So yes, it is a true story. I mean, it wasn't too disastrous. I think a man was treated for smoke inhalation, but he was okay. But I don't think the crumpets didn't fare too well. So
the crumpets didn't make it.
Crumpets didn't. No, I'm sorry.
Oh, lovely. So why do you think, I mean, part of the reason that you've written this book is to celebrate, obviously, local newspapers, talk about your own personal career, but also the fact that it's a kind of disappearing art, as more and more newspaper and news is consumed in different ways, either online with online newspapers or just on social media. I mean, it's just completely transformed in the last 20, 30 years or so. Do you really think that local newspapers are going to gradually die out?
I think, some of them have. I think dozens of local newspapers have closed in the last 10 years or so. If you look at the sales figures of the ones that are left, you have papers that used to sell, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of copies a day. They're now selling less than 10,000. The Manchester Evening News, for example, is now selling about 6,000 copies a day. I think lots of people are still reading newspapers online. They're looking at the websites, but it's very hard to make money that way. I think some publishers, even though they're selling tiny numbers of newspapers, the print section of the business is still making more money than the online version. But nowadays, everyone's reading them online. So it's very hard to find a solution. I think some independent publishers are springing up and concentrating on kind of long form, high quality features and investigative pieces, but that needs people to actually to stump up something and pay for it, which everyone says that they value local news and that they are willing to pay for it, but the figures don't always tell that story. So I think it's a case of use it or lose it. If people do value local news, I think they are going to have to pay for it, or there isn't really going to be very, very much of it left.
Definitely. Yeah, it's very sad. I mean, you can kind of see how and why it's happened, with the invent of social media and things. Years ago, people only, even, before television and before radio, people only got their news from newspapers, and it took a long time for news to travel, and people were relying on getting the paper to find out what was happening on the world, not just locally, but around the world. And as we know, that's changed dramatically. And so often news in a newspaper is often after, way after the event, when people already know because they've already read it on Twitter or whatever. So it's very difficult to compete, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, as I say, newspapers used to have pretty much a monopoly, really. And now I suppose newspapers' websites are competing against their own physical newspapers. As I say, it's very difficult for newspapers to make money online, and they've got all the other plethora of social media sites that people are looking at, and people are getting their news from various sources on Facebook and what have you that may or may not be reliable. I think the genie is out of the bottle now, so it is difficult to see a long-term future for some local newspapers, but it does come down to people. Well, it comes down to the newspapers themselves investing to make themselves, good enough for people to want to read and ultimately to want to pay to read.
Yeah. I suppose one of the big things about that differentiates local newspapers compared to the big national newspapers are these quirky local stories about a man who has burnt his crumpets and things like that. You're not going to get that as a headline in the Daily Mail, but that's the beauty of local news, isn't it? To have features on local people and find out what's going on in your local area. And you can't get that anywhere else in the same way.
That's right. I mean, obviously, if they've got a national paper, they've got the whole world to look at, not just the country. The beauty of a local paper is you're looking at a particular town or a particular county, and it's people that and it's issues that you are familiar with and that you care about. And they're written by people who live in the area as well. So, the people, even if they're not from the area originally, they live there. So, they care about them, they know about them. And there are still important stories broken by local papers. I mean, a former colleague of mine at a paper in Cumbria, he's he's broken lots of huge, national stories. He's still doing it. So, it's true that, the quirky stories, are important and popular, but, important national stories as well, that there in some cases are followed up by national papers, are still being broken by local papers all over the country. But because there are fewer local journalists left now, and the ones that are left don't have as much time, not as many stories like that are being broken, but they are still doing very, very valuable and underappreciated work.
So do you have a particular career highlight that you can think of, that you thought, yeah, you know what, I love my job?
All kinds of quirky ones, I suppose. Actually, my favourite one, the one that I think back on most fondly, is probably one of the more serious ones. It was interviewing soldiers who'd been involved in D-Day, interviewing this old guy who was by then in his 80s, and having him talk about, landing on a beach when he was 20, just walking towards the guns and having men either side of him falling, his friends and comrades, there 1 minute, gone the next. And this guy is sort of sitting there in his house, just staring, leaning forward, sort of staring into the fire, just reliving these incredible memories. And you think, this guy, he's like living history. He's the kind of thing that you read about history books. He was there. It's such a privilege to talk to people like that and to hear their stories. So it was great to interview celebrities, but they were kind of always a bit guarded and going through the motions. But it was always, so-called ordinary people who often turned out to be anything but.
Yeah. Oh, it's true. You use the word that I was going to use. It's a privilege, isn't it, to talk to these people who are snippets of history, as you say, the kind of people you read about in history books or watch in films. To actually meet and speak to these people is amazing.
Yeah, and exactly. They're just so humble as well. They just live with that for, by then he'd lived with that for probably 60 odd years, and it's just something that happened. He said that, it seems like a different person now. It was so long ago. I can't believe the things that I went through, just seeing what I saw, doing what I did. I can't believe I did it, but he did, and, we should all be thankful to them. Yeah.
So are you still working in local news now?
Yeah, I'm freelancing now. I've written, 3 books in total now, and I'm still doing freelance journalism. I was made redundant from my job in local papers 5 years ago, as so many local journalists have been. I think there are around a quarter as many local journalists working now as there were about 15 years ago. That's why the book is subtitled The Vanishing World of the Local Journalist, because there aren't that many left now. But yeah, I'm still kind of clinging on. I just love being a journalist. I love what it does for me, and I love what it can do for readers to hopefully inform and entertain. I think it's just a hugely valuable job. So yeah, I'll be doing it for as long as I can.
Yeah, great. Well, it's been lovely to chat with you, Roger Lytollis. Thank you so much for joining us. And if listeners want to get a copy of your book, Panic as Man Burns Crumpets, The Vanishing World of the Local Journalist, it's available on our website, tre.radio. Roger, thank you so much.
Thanks, Hannah. Thank you.